Urban greening can exclude when participation is missing. But what if exclusion is already written in the system? What if exclusion is inherent in today's society through land ownership patterns and the law? You can't green the city for everyone if land is not already justly distributed or effectively distributed, or rather equally distributed amongst the landowners. Because urban greening isn't really neutral, it happens on land, and land is quite contested. It is politicized. It is an asset, and in today's context, it is definitely capital. And if land is owned by the very few and developed by the powerful and shaped by exclusive laws, then no matter how beautiful the trees are, no matter how green the space is, justice still is missing. You cannot green the city if land is already unjustly distributed. Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of Bulamukani Kabiruziambela Panda. I hope that you have reflected on the questions that we have posed in the previous episode. If you haven't watched the previous episode, please do check it out. This is a continuation of the very same matters. So let's get into it then. Who is invited into urban greening processes?
So too often it's not the people who are most affected by these urban greening initiatives, right? So when cities develop these, green corridors, urban parks, and rooftop gardens, they often, invites architects, sometimes academics,
urban planners,
and environmentalists. So the people or the low-income communities, or the most people which are the most people affected, they are not, or they are rare in that room. So you can take example from the example that I mentioned in the first episode, which is about Barcelona,
New Orleans.
New Orleans, and ask yourself whether that low-income people or the surrounding communities involved in those processes, right? What their needs had, or maybe the culture which was already existing in those communities, being taken into consideration.
Yes, indeed. While expertise are of importance, they can dominate the lived experiences of residents. Residents may know more about the environment that they live in. After all, they experience it day in, day out. And yet sometimes the insight is overlooked, it's seen as unscientific, or not necessarily qualified from an expertise point of view, or rather an expert's point of view. Although as planners we have constantly been trained, or rather not planners, planning students and prospective planners, prospective planners, okay? We have been trained to conduct ourselves in practice in a way that is ethical, inclusionary, and in a way that is very much people focused. But we as planners do not function in isolation. We function in a society with various actors, and those various actors have different levels of power in the power matrix. And power can be because of access to certain resources, such as political power, financial resources, and many more. It goes beyond expertise that can overshadow the lived experiences.
Yeah, and in procedural justice, what you have to think about is that, all forms of knowledge, matters, right? It's not about the knowledge that comes from degrees, or any relevant qualifications,
Yes.
or any form of power. So we take every knowledge that exists.
Indeed, and so in relation to what you're saying, it's not selective participation, it's inclusive participation, where all knowledge is included, it is valued, it is acknowledged, and it makes a difference. So when participation is selective in urban greening is not this green space that is all exclusive and serves these benefits. It is selective and exclusive in who it caters to. And this raises the question of whose knowledge really counts and whose knowledge is valued in planning and implementation of these green urban spaces. If there's a criteria to who contributes, what happens to the people who don't meet that criteria? Are they left out, or are they simply included procedurally? Do their voices actually matter? And this reminds me of a critique about the IDP, Integrated Development Plan in South Africa, whereby it was argued that although the IDP seeks to promote participation, especially considering that in South Africa we have quite a long history of selective participation and exclusion of certain groups according to race and during the apartheid era. Participation has become a cornerstone. It has become a way to undo the injustices and make sure that everybody is included. However, participation, quite costly, quite time consuming, and time is money. So what we find is that it has been argued that at times these participatory measures, because they take time and resources, plans are often developed. However, they are used to inform people about what's already underway, rather than seek people's input to actually design and formulate those plans. It's more of, here you go, have a look, what do you think? The general public is given time to comment. Does their comment make a difference? And yeah, sorry.
You can continue.
And another thing, just one last point, is that sometimes, or in most cases, these IDPs are not written in all official languages. They are written in English, at times one or two of those languages, and also it's written in a way that's sometimes incomprehensible because of the jargon, what type of jargon is it called? The technical jargon that is in these plans.
So yeah, you are right. Like sometimes these plans, are just more of an announcement of development that are to come, right? And they don't like what just like applies to the plans that are developed. Because every plant, no matter how it's produced, it might be like what produced by the private sector. It needs to go through the municipalities, so that the municipality can open a window where people can object, this development. They can share their comments, right? But if the same people are not included in these, processes or these plans, right? How are they going to object or share their comments about these plans? So for this episode, for what we're talking about these plans, we're talking about any plans that might, associated with itself with urban greening,
Yes.
So then how does an ordinary citizen, object to these developments where they have not been included? Where do they go? And where do they start? And sometimes they can even ask themselves, is even worth it, or they're just going to waste their time? I'm sorry.
Yeah, those are realities in the urban landscape. Is it even worth it for someone to object to plans? And the point we're trying to make here is that on paper and in theory, public participation is supposed to be this initiative that enables citizens to be included in decision making and have a say that in decisions that affect them. right? But if people only hear about developments when they are well underway, and if objection is to these plans and processes is not easily accessible or inclusive, then participation feels more like an afterthought, and it becomes meaningless, doesn't it? Comment down below.
Yeah. And this is what Fana would describe as, empty signifiers, right? Where we just have ways to appreciate participation by just not describing it in our indigenous languages. For instance, I'm Venda, right? I'll be talking about the Kefaranani, also have Komanani, Ubuntu, Sisonke, Simunye, and many more. However, you find that there's a gap between theory and practices. So this touches on what makes the processes transparent and also what accountable. So with transparent, but we know that transparency ensures that every plan, policy, or decisions are accessible, accessible to everyone to understand them.
True.
Whereas accountability ensures that the decision makers answers to their actions. So if people have to raise legitimate objection, but but those concerns are ignored, or dismissed without what justification, then accountability is broken, right? So ideally, we know that there should be a system where objection influence decisions, right? Where officials or the aspect people, must explain what certain developments what proceed, and where citizens what feel their input was weighted, was heard, or they can see, the outcomes of their input.
Yes, indeed, and it has been argued, or rather, let's just say it has been argued, that procedural justice is, it's no longer about distributed, or rather it has shifted from being defined by distributive justice and how well social amenities and resources are distributed in a location, but it's about how people are included in decision making, and that affects their perception of plans, that affects how they see their status in society, and that is very important. Without transparency, people struggle to know what is happening. Without accountability, even when they do participate in the planning processes, the implementation processes, their voices may not even make a difference. When both principles are weakly implemented, they can feel more of a formality. It's just procedure, right? Rather than a genuine opportunity to include and shape decisions.
Rose stated that procedural justice is a mixture of what distributive justice as well as what collective justice. So which you have to do with promoting equitable distribution of social benefits, and also correcting the injustices. Then urban greening does not begin by just planting a tree, or maybe developing a park, or maybe green corridors. It begins with access to land, right? As you said, we said in the first one in the introduction of this episode. So then the power to control what happens on land. So this means that patterns of exclusions, more especially looking in South Africa, go beyond participation, because in what investors are made in investments are made in areas where they are already investments. So again, money is far from where money isn't. So even the participation aspect of procedural justice is followed in development processes in urban areas. So it becomes a little bit tricky when using it to build on an exclusionary foundation. Yeah. So the inequalities were brought by the systematic exclusion or system and unregulated market approaches.
I completely agree with you on that. Procedural justice is quite complex, right? Because when thinking of it in a different context, such as what we have discussed in episode 1, whereby investments act as a pull factor, and they in areas that are affluent or transitioning to become affluent, and the case where money goes where money is, and let's say participation unfolds in a way that includes the affected parties, the native and the residents of that affluent area. Then the people who are included, the people who benefit from these participation processes and transparency and accountability, and if all of that is taken into account, then the people who benefit and the people who are included are people that are affluent, the high income. Now, if development is that skewed, and it's skewed by these investment patterns, doesn't that further exclude the poor? And I think in terms of what you mentioned about the market, it has been argued that South Africa post-apartheid from 1995, it has been in a transitioning justice-centered approach. And it has been stated that the way we define procedural justice depends on the dominant justice of that time. Right now, if the dominant justice is transitional justice, which has been argued to be neoliberal, exclusive of African inputs of land being viewed as a communal space, if transitional justice is seen as this very exclusionary, slow process and market-led approaches that are very exclusionary, then how on earth are we expecting to achieve true procedural justice on that exclusionary foundation?
Yeah, I mean, the market barely compromises, right? I mean, it does not care about how people feel, or just to make it doesn't consider feelings, right? Emotion, or even sometimes of the lived experiences. If the marginalized, do not provide, then the government has to pay for the marginalized. So that goes back to why we see how development that are supposed to be for the generic public, such as urban greening, becomes a market tools that are subject to displaced people or the native groups,
Yes.
and also it leads to things like displacement, gentrification, and exclusion for the same native groups.
And the state is very much responsible for regulating the market, but clearly it has not been as efficient. And land reform is seen as this central, or rather we view it as central to urban greening. It has the ability to shape the environment, whether through development or conservation, depending on land ownership patterns. It has that ability to achieve equity. Looking at a South African aspect where over 42% of urban dwellers and urban residents are under the poverty line, land reform could serve a potential, and let me rather say it could be a huge contributor to responding to the urban poor, to catering to the needs of the urban poor through redistribution of land and ensuring equitable urban futures. But it's currently challenged with the fact that there has been a focus on rural land reform instead of urban land reform, and the historically excluded in urban greening remain sidelined or rather not even in urban greening, but in urban spaces in general. They remain sidelined by this system that we haven't shifted from for many, many years. That's quite slow, neoliberal, and quite far from native African ideologies, maybe rather put it in that way. And so, yeah, this raises a huge question about justice and these projects that are supposed to be equalizing forces for the urban poor.
Yeah, and if you think about it, that's why these unregulated markets, right, forces or perpetuate exclusions rather than to correct it. So when land is treated, as a commodity, rather than as a shared resources, right?
Yeah.
The market, that determines who gets to participate in shaping these urban spaces. Then this, what indigenous people, and the historical marginalized communities from decision making, they become erased from these processes, So even if public participation is available, it happened with the system already stacked against them.
And I completely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
If participation occurs after land is already privately owned and controlled by certain groups, such as the affluent and those with power, then procedural justice is operating from a fundamentally unjust framework. Participation cannot undo centuries of exclusion. It can only work within the boundaries of the market.
And
sad realities.
Yeah, and I feel like this is the heart of the issue, because urban greening is not about providing greening to the urban spaces, right? It's about who has the right to shape the land. And if urban land reform fails, we're not going to have urban greening that is going to be truly inclusive. It will only serve as another layer of exclusionary development cycle. Where you're just talking about beautifying urban spaces or grey spaces, but the reality is that it's just more of deep injustice or displacement, inequalities, and land privatization.
That really demonstrates a need for the prioritization of urban land reform, especially for housing purposes. That's the focus of my research topic, so that the low income can find adequate housing that is located in cities close to these social amenities, where they can access economic opportunities and share well-maintained social amenities such as green infrastructure.
Yeah, you are right, especially considering the Red Bull guidelines for human settlements, right, and design. It provides a practical guidance, for creating sustainable and vibrant human settlement in South Africa, and it states that urban greening must be planned, inclusively, ensuring that all communities, especially those, I will repeat this, especially those that were excluded during the apartheid era, must benefit from this urban greening. Because you find that during the apartheid era, and you can even take back to the colonial era, they were not included in these processes. And we know that the planning right now have been more of readdressing those inequalities. So yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And sustainable urban development requires green infrastructure, which is integrated with housing, transport, and public spaces. And that is the essence of our podcast. If we have missed anything or you have a different take to it, once again, comment down below. We are the Shadow Witnesses.